three hands to be able to carry the mic and work my computer and show the exhibits, but there we are. I will try. Thanks very much, Francis, and David as well. So I've been based in Singapore now. Yeah, and no images. Yeah, I've been in Singapore for 17 years, and the first specifically urban studies conference that I was involved in here was held at the National University of Singapore in July 2000 and entitled Southeast Asian Urban Futures. I subsequently co-edited a collection of essays from that conference entitled, delve into my little bag, Critical Reflections on Cities in Southeast Asia. Don't worry, this is the only book of mine. I'm not trying to flog them to you, right? Critical Reflections on Cities in Southeast Asia. Exhibit 1. That one's not worth passing around. Some of the others are. Okay. Now, that was a long time ago, and I have to admit that I don't remember a great deal about the Urban Futures Conference. But one of the things that's really stuck in my head all these years later is a comment that was made by one of the academics who attended the conference and also contributed to the Critical Reflections volume. I hope I haven't left anything incriminating in there. So, anyway, Abidin Kusno, an Indonesian urban studies scholar, who at that time had recently completed his PhD in the United States, remarked that he and all of the other overseas scholars who had been invited to present at the NUS conference reflected critically on parts of Southeast Asia outside of Singapore. Although I don't think he quite used these words, the implication of what he said was that, well, two things. First, that Singapore was a conducive location from which to reflect critically on urban elsewheres. In this case, specifically, cities elsewhere in Southeast Asia. And second, that Singapore was somewhere from which it might not be possible to reflect critically on Singapore itself. Now, such provocations can take us in many possible directions, into realms of geopolitics, to the geography of development, especially of uneven spatial development, and of course to the realm of debates about academic censorship or self-censorship. And the first thing that I asked myself when Abidin made his remarks was whether I or any of my co-organizers, we, had deliberately avoided critical reflection on Singapore. And the answer was, dun, 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 no, we hadn't. The reason why presenters whom we had invited to Singapore from overseas were working on other parts of urban Southeast Asia was that there was already a critical mass of scholars at NUS doing urban studies research on Singapore. This was one city about which we did not feel the need to import critical expertise. One of the contributors to the Critical Reflections volume was my colleague, Pao Chun Piu, who David Sadoway mentioned yesterday in his opening remarks. And Pao had a chapter on Suntec City as a case study of neoliberal urban entrepreneurialism. So it wasn't even true that there had been no critical reflection on Singapore in that volume, which is making its way around the room. And yet, Abidin Kusno's comments have kept nagging me. There are important reasons why I have remembered what he said until today, why his comments still resonate with my scholarly interest in the urban present and also in urban futures. A starting point for getting at these resonances is to contrast Pao's Singapore-focused essay in the Critical Reflections volume with, if you like, conventional urban studies analyses of other cities in this region. To summarize necessarily briefly and crudely here, Pao examines Suntec City in relation to neoliberal urban development and logics of intercity competition in the West, and especially in North America. In contrast, cities elsewhere in Southeast Asia have typically been examined in terms of problems of underdevelopment, to do with informal housing, service delivery for the urban poor, struggles to cope with population growth and such like. To put this in the language of the Cold War era, by the end of the 20th century, Singapore was being examined, critically or otherwise, as part of first world urban studies issues, whereas most of the rest of this region continued to be considered in terms of third world city concepts and framings. It hadn't always been that way, of course. And turning to my second exhibit, any guesses? My proud copy. I'm not. My signed copy of Terry McGee's 1967 book, The Southeast Asian City, and I will circulate this one. Yeah. willingly. The so-called urban squalor of squatter housing on the fringes of Singapore appears among images of third world urbanization and underdevelopment in that volume, and I've highlighted the relevant pages. When I started teaching urban geography at NUS, there was still a module called Urbanization in Developing Countries that had very recently included a lot of Singapore-based readings and case studies, even after a time when Singapore had famously been proclaimed to have made the transition from third world to first. Third exhibit. You can guess what this one is. If I can, my biceps are actually strong enough to hold it. There we are. Lee Kuan Yew's, yeah, so be careful. That's a sacred text, that one. The terminology may have changed, but the developmental, oh dear. Hopefully temporality is going to change. The terminology may have changed, but the developmental aspiration that third world to first encapsulates certainly hasn't gone away. And this, of course, partly accounts for the continued allure of Singapore as model. Singapore as a shining beacon of development, attracting urban planners and government officials from cities around Southeast Asia and way beyond. Going back to Abidin Kusno, Singapore is a kind of giant mirror in which the rest of this region can reflect critically on its relative lack of economic and infrastructural development. And connecting at last to the intended title of my presentation, Singapore as aspirational future for various elsewheres, regionally and globally. This way of thinking is quite pervasive, not least in the imaginings of many people in Singapore here itself. Most of my students, some of them are here actually, also some of my ex-students are here, but I think it's fair to say most of my students come into my urban geography classes believing that Singapore offers a whole host of lessons and good practices through which better futures can be realized in other cities. And leaving aside Singapore's exceptionalism as a city-state, to a considerable extent, my students are right. The post-colonial urban and economic transformation of Singapore has been, by many measures, an extraordinary success story. More widely and in more conceptual terms, present conditions in one location are an important resource for imagining alternative future possibilities in other locations. Or in the language I've begun to adopt in a research project on urban aspirations that I'm involved in with the next speaker, Daniel Goh, spatial elsewheres help to make possible imagination of temporal elsewhens. So I say to my students, okay, Singapore can conjure aspirational futures for cities in Indonesia, in Vietnam, in India, as we heard yesterday, but where do aspirational futures for Singapore lie? Can you guess what answers to that question my students give? You're responding just like the students in my class, right? Not at all, right. London, in the interest of time, London and New York are the most frequently cited. Yeah? Almost always it's affluent world or global cities of what was once called the First World. I think this is a problem, or more precisely, that it is diagnostic of wider problems and limitations that extend way beyond the lecture theatres of NUS or NTU. As far as I've seen, a similarly limited set of aspirational elsewheres to those cited by my students are drawn upon by state, quasi-state, and non-state actors in Singapore more widely. How do we account for this limited geographical imagination? One explanation has to do with inherited, and I would say still quite ingrained, legacies of modernization theory, through which the whole world is mapped into a series of temporal stages of specifically economic development. And by extension, it is believed that useful lessons can only be learned from those elsewheres that are more developed or at so-called higher stages. Even if one somehow still believes that better futures are reducible specifically to economic development, without consideration of social, cultural, political, or ecological dimensions, the modernization pathway to the future has pretty much run its course in Singapore. There are simply very few elsewheres with greater levels of material prosperity left to look up to. So again, where to look to now? Increasingly, the answer seems to be to look at so-called livable cities. And while I certainly believe that the quest for livability is preferable to the quest for economic growth alone, the cities that are valorized through livability rankings remain a very limited set of urban elsewheres, mostly in the West. I encourage my students to diversify the possible elsewheres that they might learn from or looked to as resources for alternative futures here in Singapore. This can begin from taking seriously an expanded range of ways of evaluating and comparing cities and urban lives in the present. If our indices of comparison are, say, the active role of civil society in socio-spatial experimentation or public participation in the planning process, then Singapore is not necessarily the model that it has become in many other ways. And a range of other Asias, other urban Asias, plural, even cities in Southeast Asia, may then be able to help us to reflect critically on Singapore itself, which of course I think is what Aberdeen Kusno was hinting at all those years ago. Above all, in this way, geographical imaginations are expanded and a wider and more diverse range of elsewheres can become part of aspirational futures for Singapore. I know I've had my stop sign, but just two last sentences because they relate to the opening provocation. So finally, and relating to the provocation, which I very much enjoyed, I just want to emphasize that I believe that openness to diverse aspirational or dream elsewheres as resources for possible elsewheres is crucial. This means embracing Southeast Asia's plural, multiple other Asias, and that is actually my fourth exhibit, dun, 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 other Asias, David mentioned, and as Spivak put it, and I'm not sure quite how comfortably that sits alongside a pan-Asian framing or trajectory. Thank you very much.